Hello everyone, this is Mr. Dundon from AnytimeEducation.com, and we've got John Williams on Twitter asking, how is DNA, or the universal presence of DNA, evidence for evolution and common ancestry? John, we're going to give you some help, so let's get stuck in. Okay, so let's try and give John some help. So remember, he wants to know how DNA provides evidence for evolution and common ancestry. Okay, well let's take the theory that maybe it doesn't. Okay, so remember that in all species, DNA is universal. Okay, geez. Amazing coincidence, don't you think? So every single organism contains DNA. If that wasn't through a process of evolution where one organism shares that information on, how did every single organism independently create DNA to be its genetic storage device? Remember, DNA is used to control all the manufacturing of all the structures in the cell. It also controls all the cellular processes. So for that not to be caused by evolution, every single species that we see today would have had to independently create DNA as their storage device. Is that likely? That's for you to decide. We also see the same DNA sequences code for the same proteins in a process called transcription and translation. If you want to know more details about that, check out any of our other videos on AnytimeEducation.com. But basically we're saying the same sequence codes for the same protein. Now, if there wasn't any connection between all species, why is that the case? Why can't in one species a section of DNA code for a different combination of proteins and amino acids, so a different combination of amino acids, than another species with the same sequence? It doesn't happen that way though in nature. We have similar species share similar sequences. Now again, if they were independent of one another, why do they share those similar sequences? Could there be maybe a connection? So if this DNA is universal, same sequence, same protein, similar species share similar sequences, the probability of all of that occurring independently and occurring in every single species is mind-boggling. So there must be some kind of connection where one species can pass that information on, and then perhaps through mutation we get changes, and then through mutation some of that population then has a reproductive advantage. That reproductive advantage leads to that part of the population surviving and then passing on, and so on and so on and so on. Remember, we call that process natural selection and speciation. So universal presence of DNA and evolution and common ancestry, if it's not independent, then they must all be linked. That's our alternate hypothesis. So if that's the case, what we suspect and what our theories are is we have, single cell species developing, millions, 100 millions, billions of years ago, single cell species developing. Those single cell species may have had changes to DNA through mutation, which causes them to be slightly different. And what we sort of see now is all of our species on Earth can sort of be connected to sort of 5 main types of cells. Some sort of classification experts go into a little bit more detail, but we can sort of classify them into Nera, Monera, fungi, protists, my favourite, animals and plants. And all species within those sort of groups have very similar cells. So what's probably likely is that we have a population. They get changes to their DNA. Remember, the only way we can get change to DNA or new DNA sequences is through our process of mutation. And mutation is changing the sequence of DNA. Now that mutation rate's quite stable. Okay, so that mutation rate is quite stable. Okay, so we've got a population, we get mutation. That mutation then slightly adjusts individuals within that population. And if they change enough through mutation and they have new selective pressures, check out natural selection video, new selective pressures, then those with the mutations that allow them to succeed and reproduce are going to, and they're going to pass that DNA on. So occasionally we get this diverging of one population to two new species. So this could be species B now and species C. And then species B, again, population divides, new natural selection processes, mutation, and we divide again. Every time we see this divide, these are areas where we say that this was a common ancestor. So species B was a common ancestor, now species D and species E. And then it continues, branches, we form these what we call phylogenetic trees, and so on. So as we move down, we have increased time for DNA change. Okay, so mutation adds change, natural selection speciation minimize genetic variation. So mutation increases genetic variation, natural selection speciation removes genetic variation because it ends up selecting for the most, for the organisms that have the biggest advantage in that environment. Okay, so a common ancestor is sort of the population or the species that was around before they diverged. So what we would then say here is, the further down we go, these species are more related. How can we check that? Well, if we sequence their DNA, what we find are close relationships in DNA sequence between here. And that makes sense because they've had less time for mutation to change their DNA sequences. Okay, so the further up we go, the more change between species until we get up to the final top here and we've got these 5 different types of cells. And as we go all the way down, these species are going to be the most closely related. Okay, so check out phylogenetic trees as well, they're fascinating. So I guess you've got to ask yourself, or I guess for people that believe in God, I think the question becomes not does evolution and common ancestry exist, but could God be responsible for setting one of the most elegant and simple processes into place in nature? Hope that helps. Mr. Dundon, catch you later.